on her neighborhood corner every week and does a lot of community service and community building and trying to deter violence in the area. And she also talks about her Jewish identity as motivating her. So I think it'll be a great opportunity. And for those of you who aren't getting our emails, who would like to, you can email Jewish Studies, look at our link and our website, or email me personally at Aronoff. You see my last name there, Aronoff, Y with the first letter, and then at msu.edu. And I know we have lots of students with us today, lots of MSU students who are taking lots of different courses that relate to this topic. And if any of you would like to discuss becoming a Jewish Studies minor with me, please email me as well, and I'd be happy to do that because a lot of your courses count towards the minor. So I think without further ado, I'll get started. And I think it's a really refreshing opportunity because our four panelists have not only spent decades studying the peace process between Israel and Palestine, but also participating in various ways in the peace process, in our government, in the Palestinian Authority, and as academics studying it and in think tanks, and several of you, if not all of you, continue to influence policy on this matter. So it's just a real joy to have all of you. It's also really nice because, as many of you know, sometimes the subject can elicit great polarization and even demonization. And what's wonderful about our four panelists is they operate within a general framework that they agree with, generally speaking, in terms of a two-state solution. So the dialogue is always one of mutual respect and constructive dialogue and optimism in terms of what can actually be done to move things forward in a positive way. And it's so refreshing to have that kind of constructive conversation that will enlighten us, and then to look for ways that you complement each other and ways that you may disagree, but all within that common basic framework and modeling that mutual respect that I know all of you do, which is just a fantastic model for all of us during this polarized time. So I think we'll start with Ambassador and Professor Dan Kurtzer. I'd like to welcome you back to MSU because I think you were just here a couple of years ago speaking at the Kellogg Center. But you'll be talking about top down, bottom up, inside out, outside in, which way to Israeli-Palestinian peace. Daniel Kurtzer is the Daniel Abram Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. He had a 29-year career in the State Department and was ambassador to Israel and ambassador to Egypt. And he was also a speechwriter and a member of Secretary of State George Shultz's policy planning staff, and served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs and as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research. So he spent 3 decades in our government and twice as ambassador. And he wrote co-edited 3 fantastic books that I've assigned all 3 books in my classes at MSU. And I recommend them to all students who want to investigate or research these areas further. Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, American Leadership in the Middle East is a fantastic book analyzing US administrations and where they fell short, what they could do better, with lots of documents in the end, including the Clinton parameters and other documents. The Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, 1989 to 2011, and editor of Pathways to Peace, American and the Arab-Israeli Conflict. And all these books provide insights as how we can move things forward and learn from the past in a very constructive way. So we're really honored to have you. I'm going to share, should I share now your slides?
I'll give you a signal in a moment.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Professor Aronoff, and thank you to Michigan State. I do wish there comes a time when I can come back. I had a good time on campus, and it's good to join my colleagues, Saliba, David, and Ghaith. If we had been asked to give you a sense of the Arab-Israeli conflict in a minute, I would tell you that in some ways it is as contentious and problematic as any other protracted conflict, but in some other ways it's not. It's not all that challenging. The reason I say that is because if you look at leaders and people, if the leaders in that region, Palestinian and Israeli, and if the people of Palestine and Israel really wanted to make peace, there are enough pathways for them to choose from. And what I want to do tonight is focus on some of those pathways, um, possibly what they have been choosing, what might be an ideal situation, and then what we're likely to see, particularly in a Biden administration. So let's start the screen share now. So I call this, you'll see the screen in a moment, I call this top down, bottom up. Okay. You see on this screen on the right-hand side are the various options or outcomes that people have been looking at as possibilities for the way this conflict comes to an end. And there are quite a few more, but I just gave you a sense here of various ways in which people say this conflict should be resolved. One state, a state that includes both Palestinians and Israelis, two states, which has been the classic potential solution. There's a possibility of three states if Gaza were hived off of the West Bank, Confederation, and so forth. And as you can tell from the variety of options, there is not yet a consensus on where this is going to end up. What you see on the left-hand side of the screen is a plethora of possible strategies. And here too, there are more than are on this slide. At the top, you have Trump's vision, which he put out last January. It hasn't gotten hasn't seen much success except in parts of Israel. But then you have other options, unilateralism, creeping annexation. Palestinians are pursuing some degree of lawfare in International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. There's an idea about going back to an international conference. In other words, even when it comes to trying to figure out where to go in this peace process, there are no consensus possibilities. And so if you even had leadership and popular support for a peace process, one of the first things that would need to get done is to figure out where you're heading so you don't head off in many different directions, and what strategy you would follow in order to get there. Let's go to the next slide. So what I've tried to do is indicate 6 components of a serious peace process. And I call them top down, bottom up. You'll see in a moment. There it is, 6 components of a serious peace process. Go to the next one, there we go. Top down would be the focus on the core issues that need to be dealt with. Borders, security, Jerusalem, refugees, economic issues, even the electromagnetic spectrum, who controls the borders, who controls the airspace. In any protracted conflict, some semblance of these issues will divide the parties, and it exists also in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And so a peace process that's serious would have to have a sense of how to deal with these issues. And to do that, you need terms of reference. You can't simply start a negotiation in which each side walks into the room, one side looking at 0, the other side looking at 100, and expect to have results. And that's why there would need to be a preliminary set of discussions on the parameters for negotiations. The next slide. But you also need, as we've seen over 30 or 40 years of this peace process, the need to deal with the issues on the ground that make it difficult, particularly for the Palestinians, to come to negotiations and take them seriously. Palestinians are living under occupation. There's a basic asymmetry to these negotiations between Israel as an occupying authority, Palestinians as the people under occupation seeking to negotiate their way out of occupation. And you need, therefore, to deal with issues such as the Palestinian economy, investment, public-private partnerships, and institution building, something that we know some years ago, former Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad tried to do, and then was cut short by his own people. So while you are working on terms of reference for negotiations, you also have to improve Palestinian lives, not as a substitute for the terms of reference, but as a complement to those terms of reference. The next slide. I also see the need for what's called outside in, and we're experiencing some of that now with the normalization agreement that was reached between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, and the agreement that was reached between Bahrain, and the possibility that some other countries in the Middle East or in North Africa may decide to normalize relations with Israel even before the Palestinian issue is resolved. The point being that there are issues in that region which would benefit from Arab-Israeli cooperation, Arab-Israeli-Palestinian cooperation, and therefore there's no reason for Arab states to wait for a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli issue, but they can start to take specific steps that create a safety net for the Palestinians, that give some confidence to the Israeli people that this would be a peace larger than simply between Israelis and Palestinians. And you could therefore have another complementary activity of Arab-Israeli normalization while there is an effort to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli question. Next slide. There's also a question of inside out. One of the main issues that figured or didn't figure in the negotiations in the 1990s was the absence of people-to-people activities. In other words, in the 90s, there was a full range of negotiations, bilateral, multilateral. There were economic conferences. Most of them involved government officials, and they were very useful and helpful. But the average person on the street, whether in Tel Aviv or Ramallah, didn't have a real sense of the possibility of progress. And therefore, the idea of creating a network of people-to-people activities along with public-private partnerships involving business people, peace-building activities, these would be critical as an additional element in a peace process. Next slide. Also a need for confidence-building measures. In other words, actions that are designed to build confidence on both sides. And as those actions get carried out, the two sides see that the other side is serious. The problem with confidence-building measures, or as they're called, CBMs, is very often there's an assumption that they should take place in anticipation of a peace process. And the hard lesson we've learned in the last 35 or 40 years is that very often the idea of confidence-building measures in advance of a serious peace process end up being confidence-destroying measures. In other words, two sides don't end up doing what they want. The other side reads it the wrong way. And instead of helping the process move forward, the process is set back. Alongside this process, CBMs could be very important because as the parties are negotiating, as people are talking to each other, as Arab states are coming in, specific issues can be defined that can help build confidence, whether visits or joint activities or whatever. Next slide. And the last of the 6 components is what I call accountability. And I spent a lot of time on this in my classes at Princeton. One of the main deficits of almost every aspect of the peace process until now has been the absence of a monitoring mechanism to hold the parties responsible for what they've undertaken to do or what they failed to do that they promised to do. And there's no accountability and there's no consequences. And so you have a peace process in the past that kind of merrily goes along. The two sides do things that destroy confidence, and nobody from the outside or even the parties possibly have agreed, nobody holds them accountable for what happens next. Next slide. So the question then is this a possibility? Is it possible that we're going to have this multifaceted, 6-sided monster happening in the period ahead? And reality is we're not. If the leaders are not there, if the people are not there, this becomes an idea to shoot for, but not one that we could realistically expect. And so I want to conclude with a sense of what a Biden administration might do. The question, of course, is going to be what would happen in a second Trump administration, and we can talk about that. Maybe some of my colleagues could speculate. But my own view is that the Trump vision of peace is so faulted and so lacking in seriousness that it would be very hard to ignite any kind of a peace process based on that peace process. And therefore, what I want to look at tonight is what happens if Joe Biden wins and he inherits this very fraught situation on the ground. First, I think Biden would have to make clear that he doesn't accept the elements of the Trump vision that have been so inimical to longstanding American views on the peace process. And we can discuss those in detail. There's a long list of issues in the 181-page Trump plan that really take the Trump administration out of the peace process game. Next slide. Second thing would be to put Jerusalem back on the table. And what I mean by that is not to move the American embassy out of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is Israel's capital, or West Jerusalem is Israel's capital, but to give the Palestinians a sense that they too can have a capital in Jerusalem. In other words, to find a way, probably rhetorically, to say to the Palestinians that the United States recognizes that their capital will be in East Jerusalem, and the United States will recognize that capital in East Jerusalem when there's a settlement, just as we have recognized Israel's capital in Jerusalem. The Trump administration, quote unquote, took Jerusalem off the table. Biden can put it back on the table so that it's not a barrier to a possibility of restarting something later on. Next slide. One of the main faults of the Trump administration's approach was to cut off communications with Palestinians and to have those communications cut off by the Palestinians. And in a sense, the Trump administration contributed to this by shutting down the PLO office in Washington, D.C. To reopen that office will require some degree of consensus also on the Hill in Congress, but it's a very definite signal that has to be sent in order to say to the Palestinians that there's a place where they can communicate formally and officially to the Biden administration. Next slide. Similarly, the United States closed its consulate in East Jerusalem, which had served for many years as a conduit of information and perspectives from the Palestinians, and integrated that office into the American embassy in Jerusalem, which for the Palestinians was a signal that there was no real interest in hearing their views. We need to open a consulate for the Palestinians, whether it's in East Jerusalem or outside of Jerusalem. It almost doesn't matter, although for symbolic reasons, they would clearly want it in East Jerusalem, but it has to be a place where they can come, feel comfortable, and convey their ideas to the American government, not through an American embassy that's accredited to the State of Israel. Next slide. The United States also cut off aid to the Palestinian Authority and to the UN agency that deals with Palestinian refugees. And when the United States administration didn't cut off aid, the Congress restricted that aid by putting conditions which made it almost impossible for Palestinians to accept any aid. This would require a substantial amount of work and consensus on Capitol Hill, but it's important in order for the United States to get back in the game seriously with the Palestinian Authority and the PLO. Next slide. As a long shot possibility, the United States might reaffirm its longstanding view about the illegality of settlements. Back in the 1970s, the United States called settlements illegal. Trump administration said they're not. I doubt that the Biden administration would say this, but it is certainly a long shot possibility. And the final point, next slide. The United States also recognized Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights. It's a little bit outside of the Palestinian issue, but it sent a message, a chill message through the international community that the United States was ready to recognize Israel's unilateral hold on the Golan Heights, absent negotiations. So this is what I call the top-down, inside-out, bottom-up, whatever we want to call it, and a more realistic approach. And the hope is that the Biden administration will adopt some of these measures and we can at least put the peace process back on track in some way, even if we don't make substantial progress. Thank you, Yael.
Thank you. I see that we had about 97 participants and some people are already putting up questions. We're going to hear from all the panelists. Then I'm going to pose a question or two, and then we'll open it up to everyone. So we're giving us a 2-hour period until 9 o'clock. So we'll get as many questions as possible when the panelists are done. So our next speaker is going to be Ghaith Al-Omari. He's going to be speaking about small steps towards a big goal, preserving the two-state solution in times of profound change. He's a senior fellow in the Washington Institute's Irwin Levy Family Program on the U.S.-Israel Strategic Relationship, where he's written dozens of essays, and is the former executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine. Prior to that, he served in various positions within the Palestinian Authority, including director of the International Relations Department, the Office of the Palestinian President, and advisor to former Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas. He provided advice on foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis the United States and Israel and security. His extensive experience in the Palestinian-Israeli peace process, having been an advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team throughout the permanent status negotiations from 1999 to 2001. He participated in various negotiating rounds, most notably the Camp David Summit and Taba talks. And after the breakdown of the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, he was the lead Palestinian drafter of the Geneva Initiative, an unofficial model peace agreement negotiated between leading Palestinian and Israeli public figures. He's a lawyer by training and graduate of Georgetown and Oxford University. So it's a real honor to have you with us. Ghaith Al-Omari, welcome also back to MSU, because you and David Makovsky were both together here about 10 years ago or so. Again, speaking in person, and you're such a wonderful team that we're having you back again this evening. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Yael. I mean, thank you for putting this together. Thank you for the amazing, superb work that you do on this issue and other issues. One thing I wouldn't thank you is that you're putting me after Dan, because I basically agree with everything Dan has to say. So there's not really much that I can add. So what I'll try to do instead is maybe dig a bit deeper into some of the issues that he talked about and see how we can maybe operationalize these. But before I do that, maybe I will start with, my own view of what, when we talk about Palestinian-Israeli peace, to my mind, this really can only mean one thing, and that is the two-state solution as a final outcome. To my mind, this comes from the very basic assumption that this is a conflict between two national movements that can only find their fulfillment through the creation of a homeland of their own. For the Zionist movement, it needs the creation of a homeland for the Jewish people, a state that's a homeland for the Jewish people. For the Palestinian national movement, they need a state that's a homeland for the Palestinian people. Anything short of a two-state solution can simply not provide that. The idea of a one state will basically not resolve this question. It will transform it from an international conflict to a civil war, but the conflict continues. So to my mind, a two-state solution ultimately is the way to get there. And by the way, I'm also a believer, as the title suggests, that the door is open. It is still possible. I mean, I hear a lot that it is no longer possible because of settlements, etc., etc. And while, yes, settlements and action on both sides has been detrimental, the bottom line, in practical terms, a two-state solution is still possible. In the classical sense, settlements occupy a certain amount of land that can be offset by a land swap. I think my colleague David Makovsky, to make a plug for him, he has an amazing website with great detail about settlements and how many people live there and where they are. And you can look at the website and see that in practice, the two-state solution is still possible. Yet, that said, it is going through an extremely profound and maybe even lethal challenges. And to my mind, these challenges really boil down to one thing, is that even though it's possible, people are starting to lose faith in it. If you look at polls on the Palestinian side, on the Israeli side, the number of people who believe in a two-state solution is getting lower and lower. And when you ask the question, most of them would tell you, yes, in theory, we might like it, but in reality, we don't think it's going to happen. Therefore, we are not going to pin our hopes onto something that is just simply a pipe dream. So a key challenge right now is, how do you reestablish faith in a two-state solution? And here we have to look at why the faith in a two-state solution has been eroding. There are many reasons, and I will mention maybe three. First of all, it has been under sustained attack. It's been under sustained attack. Traditionally, we've seen this attack from the right, whether it is the kind of maximalist side on the Israelis' right, or on the Palestinian side, on the kind of, Islamist movements, Hamas and others who do not believe in it. But more recently, we're starting to see assault on the concept also from the left, presenting its own very maximalist view of how do you resolve the conflict. More important than this, perhaps, is that it's been under attack from some high officials. And here I would point to, frankly, Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, who was forced and dragged, kicking and screaming, to say two-state solution, I believe, in 2011 at Bar Ilan University. And ever since, there's messaging has been against it. The Trump administration, I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I have to say that they did, in the Trump peace plan, talk about a two-state solution. And symbolically speaking, at least, it's important because it shows continuity in US policy. But I think, as Dan mentioned, if you go beyond the title and read what's in it, it's not really a two-state solution. No Palestinian can subscribe to that. And as a matter of fact, for many Palestinians, at least, anecdotally that I speak to people, they would tell me, if this is a two-state solution you're calling for, I ain't gonna buy this. This is not something that is compelling. This actually undermines faith in a two-state solution by presenting it as an unappealing concept. So we need to start rehabilitating and sending different kinds of messaging. But to go beyond that, and one of the problems facing those who support the two-state solution is that, frankly, we do not have much to show for what we stand for, whether it's a two-state solution or whether it is the path to that, which is diplomacy. And this is fairly new. I mean, for those of us who were around and involved in the 1990s, a big part of the enthusiasm and the energy that we had was not only kind of, the aspirational side of things, but we saw progress. Those of us, Palestinians, Israelis, Americans who were involved in this, we actually saw progress. The public saw progress. They saw deliverables. Palestinians saw Israelis pulling out of Palestinian territory. Israelis saw security cooperation and other kinds of cooperation. Since really the late 20th century and throughout, we have only seen failures. Failures in the big picture, but also failure in the small f. Palestinians today can only see the negative aspects of the conflict. Israelis today can only see the negative aspects of the conflict. A generation, or maybe two, have grown with no success to look at, and they associate the idea of a two-state solution with failure, and there's nothing more lethal in politics than failure. And finally, and as a result of this failure, we see a sense that there is no partner on the other side. I'm not divulging a secret when I say that Palestinians and Israelis are not guilty of introspection, too much introspection. And what we often see is Palestinians very strongly believe that Israelis are not partners and they're behind the failure, and they will point to settlements and other Israeli measures. And Israelis believe that there is no partner on the Palestinian side, and they will point to security and other failures on the Palestinian side. So today, there is really no faith that there is a partner on the other side, and therefore it becomes hard to get someone to believe in this. So the question becomes, how do you address these issues, and how do we start shifting the trajectory from this lack of faith that ultimately might lead to the abandonment of a two-state solution into rehabilitating the concept? And here, there are a lot of things that can be done. But maybe let me start with what should not be done. I don't believe that we can and we should re-engage in a peace process that is designed in the short term to reach a Palestinian-Israeli peace deal. It will fail. It will fail because Palestinian politics cannot carry it right now. The Palestinians are divided. The Palestinian Authority has a legitimacy deficit, and we can go on and on and on. And the Israeli politics cannot kind of support the kind of necessary concessions that Israel has to make to reach that deal. You look at the political electoral map in Israel today, you see some of the shifts in Israeli politics. You look at the Israeli government as we see it today. This is not a government that is capable of making the necessary concessions in the same way that the Palestinian leadership is incapable of making necessary concessions. And I learned one thing is that failure comes with a price, and another failed major negotiation will come with a price and will further erode faith in a two-state solution. Instead, we need to go to other measures, maybe less ambitious, but more achievable. One, and here I fully agree with Dan, we need to reaffirm a two-state solution. The US need to reaffirm it, whether it's a Biden administration or a new Trump administration. I think we need to have a counter-offensive in terms of reaffirming international commitment to this one. But beyond that, we actually need to start looking at small steps, things that are concrete, that can make a visible, clear difference in the lives of Palestinians and Israelis. And here you have a huge amount of a list of issues that we can go through. First of all, let me start saying that a lot of what I'm going to suggest are things that, 10 years ago would have been maybe difficult to push, because many Israelis of good faith will tell you that a lot of these steps are not possible because they represent a security threat to Israel. Today, we have a very interesting, under reported, but I think key dynamic between the Palestinian Authority and Israel is that there is very strong, steady security cooperation that has made a lot of things possible. And today, if you look in Israel, you see a lot of the ideas that I will propose coming actually from the Israeli security and intelligence and military establishment, because they know that you can do things for the Palestinians without harming Israel. And these, as I said, span the spectrum from small economic steps that will impact people's lives, opening industrial zones, things of this sort. It can go all the way up to extending the Palestinian Authority's jurisdiction in key issues like zoning, building permits, things of this sort, to deal with some of the real challenges that Palestinians are facing in increasingly urbanized and congested areas. And in between the economic and the territorial, there is, as I said, a whole list of things that we can talk about. Now, none of these steps that I'm proposing will actually resolve the conflict. The key big issues that Dan mentioned, refugees, Jerusalem, borders, etc., these can only be resolved by negotiations. But these small steps will do a number of things. First of all, I think they are good in their own right. I think the Palestinians deserve to live a more dignified life, and the Israelis deserve security. And I think these kind of steps will give both that. But beyond that, it will, first of all, rehabilitate the idea that cooperation can produce good results. We'll show Palestinians and Israelis that cooperation can produce good results in ways that we were shown back in the 1990s. And it will also rehabilitate the idea of partnership. It allows a Palestinian who wants to work with Israelis to say, look, these are good things that the Israelis are doing. We have partners on the Israeli side. And it allows Israelis who want to work with Palestinians to say, look, we are giving the Palestinians more space and they are true security partners. So these kind of steps might not end the conflict, but these are certainly things that would maybe shift the dynamic. And here, I have to say that the new normalization agreements between Israel and the UAE and the Bahrain could actually help in this dynamic. I mean, one very interesting aspect of the UAE Israel deal is that there was actually linkage between normalization between that Gulf state and Israel and the Palestinian issues. When the Emiratis, the UAE, demanded that Israel suspends its annexation plans, it has set a precedent that, by the way, Prime Minister Netanyahu was unwilling to kind of engage in the past. This allows the space for other Arab countries who want to have relations with Israel, even if not the full normalization, even states that want to have smaller normalizations, like what the Saudis did recently by opening the airspace to Israelis, to link this to Palestinian-Israeli progress, to link this to pressuring the Palestinians to do what they have to do, but also insisting that the Israelis deliver something to the Palestinians to push that process forward. I will conclude by saying a point that I was not planning to say, but since Dan mentioned it, I think it's worth mentioning, which is the idea of people to people. And I have to say, in the past, if you were talking to me in the 1990s, I would have been dismissive. I would have been dismissive because Palestinians and Israelis were engaging one another on a very organic, normal way, and there was an understanding between the two sides, even though, of course, there was enmity, but there was a degree of understanding. Today, we don't see that. Today, there are strong dynamics in both societies against this kind of engagement. Today, you have leaderships in both societies that penalize this kind of engagement. Yet, in spite of all of this, we see courageous Palestinians and courageous Israelis, young and old, of all ages and genders and everywhere, continue to engage and to pay a price for us. And I think it is incumbent on us, whether it is we are private citizens or whether those of us in government, to actually support this kind of work, because it is essential. It's essential to at least create a degree of understanding of what the other side is. Again, I will conclude by saying, if the choices that I saw ahead of us were either, real peace tomorrow, or these small steps, obviously we'll go for real peace. These small steps come with a lot of their own baggage. But I simply do not see a final peace deal as available. But I see these small steps as a realistic, accessible ideas with supporters in the Palestinian-Israeli establishment. We can start them at least to stop this erosion. And if we're really lucky and if we're really skillful and with good US leadership, if we have that, we can even maybe use it to move the needle a little bit closer back to a two-state solution. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the questions and answers.
Thank you for your constructive and motivating insights. Next, we're going to have David Makovsky. He's going to speak about Bridge or Bypass Road. How do peace moves between Arab states and Israel challenge the way we think about the Palestinian issue? Also, welcome back again to MSU. David Makovsky was here, I think, just last year, talking about his new book that he wrote with Dennis Ross, Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. And he was also, as I said, at MSU 10 years ago with Ghaith, Al-Omari. He is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and Director of the Project on Arab-Israeli Relations. He is also an adjunct professor in Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University's Paul Mucci School of Advanced International Studies. And in 2013 to 2014, he worked in the Office of the US Secretary of State, a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. In addition to the book that I just mentioned, he also wrote with Dennis Ross again, Myths, Illusions, and Peace, Finding a New Direction for America in the Middle East, which was a 2009 Washington Post bestseller. And he has a podcast, for those of you who'd like to tune into that, Decision Points, the US-Israeli Relationship, which features interviews with authors, scholars, and practitioners on key moments in the history of US-Israeli relations. And I think Ghaith mentioned his maps on alternative territorial solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict were reprinted in the New York Times. I've used them in my classes. And you can look at the multiple articles written by David Makovsky and Ghaith Al-Omari if you go to the Washington Institute of Near East Policy. So thanks for joining us again, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yael. It's an honor to be back with you, even though albeit virtually, digitally, with you and the MSU students. Thank you for having me with this distinguished panel. It's great to be with them. I just want to, if I can, just to kind of frame things. I think, you'll hear from Saliba next, but I think that so far, if I could just clarify, because we've thrown a lot at you, is all of us want to see a two-state solution. There's no difference between Dan, Ghaith, myself, and Saliba, I believe. Where do we differ? And we differ over whether you can go to the core issues, what we call final status, what Dan called the top-down part. Everything else there is really not, is not controversial at all. And we would all like there to go to that top-down, to those 5 core issues: the borders, the security, refugees, Jerusalem, mutual recognition. Do you accept the character of the other side state? If it was possible, we would all want to do it tomorrow. We've all devoted so much time to this conflict, we want it to be over. So there's really no difference there. But the difference is that I think Ghaith and myself both think that if we go again to what we would call final status, the 5 core issues, we're guaranteed an explosion, a political explosion. We hope not a violent explosion. But it's not that we haven't tried. If anything, the United States, we have internalized the Palestinian critique about the limits of gradualism from the 90s in the United States on 3 efforts. Clinton in 2000, Condoleezza Rice's effort, 2007-8, effort I was a part of in the Obama administration with Secretary of State John Kerry. These were all efforts not to go incremental, but to go big and to try to solve all these core issues. So it isn't that it hasn't been tried, it's been tried 3 times. The problem is that the Venn diagram between the Israeli-Palestinian leadership on these 5 issues do not overlap. And therefore, to go a 4th time, when in theory, the Trump plan is a 4th effort, so I'm going to talk about a 5th time, seems like, we're just a mission impossible, and we're going to lead to another crisis. And as Ghaith says, every failure has a penalty to it. I think we're united, the three of us, on the fact that we don't see the Trump plan as a substitute. Why? And I think it's important to say why. Because the map, and I'm sorry I don't have my own maps here, but the three other peace plans were based on the idea that Israel would keep the cluster of settlements largely adjacent to Israeli urban areas, near the Green Line, and within the security barrier. That goes up to 8% of the West Bank, but there would be offsets known as land exchanges. The Trump plan does something completely different. It flips the script. And it says, no, we don't want just Israel to be in charge of settlements near its borders. We want it to be in charge of all settlements throughout the West Bank. So instead of right now, let's say 52 settlements with 358,000 people inside the security barrier, this would now be 130, not 52, 130. And actually it only add another 107,000 people, but they're scattered all over. So any Palestinian state would not be contiguous. You'd have impossible boundaries to defend. And frankly, the Palestinians wouldn't be in charge of it because under the Trump plan, Israel is to the north, Israel is to the south, Israel is to the east, and Israel is to the west. And therefore, Israel will decide who goes in and out, and Israel will decide security. It doesn't really meet the standard of at least a modicum of sovereignty, even though all of us understand this would have to be a demilitarized Palestinian state. So I think what unites the three of us is a sense that it won't work. And it's not out of animus for any party or president or anything like that, God forbid, out of respect. But I think it just won't work. So I think going for final status of trying to hit the home run the fourth time is another strikeout. So in my view, whenever it's all or nothing in the Mideast, it's nothing. And I would like to see, and here I think Ghaith and I are more similar because we believe more, let's go back to gradualism and see what could empower Palestinians, could give them hope, because we see the critics on all sides. And as Ghaith said correctly, it came out of assault. It's been under attack, the two-state solution, but we think that there's got to be steps that could build it up. Now, here we've got a new context, a new regional context. If I was a Michigan State student, I'd say, what's new here? What's new here is that the Middle East is changing. And I think, there's always going to be rejectionist forces, but what we're seeing with the breakthroughs of the last few months, I think, points to something different. And it's important to understand where we came from. In 1967, there was something called the Khartoum Conference of the Arab League, which said, 3 no's, I think no recognition, no negotiation, no peace with Israel. In 1979, Anwar Sadat, made peace with Israel. The Arab League's seat was in Cairo because Egypt's the most important populated Arab state. And the Arab League left Cairo for a decade to protest over an Egyptian-Israeli peace, saying it was like a separate peace. Now, the Arab state, the Palestinians just a few weeks ago, after the Emirati breakthrough, wanted to complain and have the Arab League come out against that. And what they found was they hit a brick wall of opposition within the Arab world. And this is what's key, not about Israel, but it's the Arab states saying, no, every sovereign state is sovereign. They could go its own way, make their own decisions. That is a shift. This is all done by Arab foreign ministers on Zoom in the age of COVID. So we've gone from Khartoum to Zoom. It's a new era that, it's an earthquake compared to what was. And when the Arab Peace Initiative came out in 2002, it was a carrot. It was basically to say, look, give the Palestinians what they want. If you give them what they want, we will normalize relations with Israel at the end of that process. Now, it was very backloaded. I used to jokingly call it the end of the rainbow. But what needs to be said, and it's the kind of the elephant in the room, is that the API, the Arab Peace Initiative, this sequencing of withholding all ties with Israel didn't work for 18 years. And we have to be honest, it didn't work for 18 years. First of all, Israel was doing stuff under the table with the Arab states before this Emirati breakthrough, including with the Emirates itself and Bahrain itself. But it is only intensified because the big picture here is that these countries have their own interests. And maybe they didn't see Israel as relevant to them in 2002, so they could wait for not just 18 years, but 36 years, 54 years, and whatever it is, because they didn't really care about Israel. But what was once a carrot in 2002 now seems more like a stick. Now to tell people, you know, defer your own interests. And then that defer means Iran, where the Arabs and Israelis see it similarly. I jokingly say that Ayatollah Khamenei deserves a Nobel Peace Prize for bringing Arab states and Israel together. So you have that piece, and you've got an aligned regional thinking on, on different radical groups in the Middle East. They see it very similarly, the Gulf and Israel. And there's technology, which is, these are the two most globally countries of the Middle East, most technologically focused. It's not a good analogy for different reasons, but it's almost like an agreement between Google and Microsoft in terms of their globalized vision. And I think, you know, when the Emirates has a sovereign wealth fund of $1.3 trillion to deal with investments outside of its borders in high tech and the like, and Israel's a startup nation, there's endless possibilities. If I was a Michigan State student and I wanted to study the Middle East today, I would say, wow, this is an amazing earthquake. Yes, there was stuff under the table, but this could go to a whole different level. There's amazing potential here. Now, you could respond to this in different ways. People on the right could exult and say, this is a bypass road. You know, now Israel doesn't have to deal with the Palestinians because it's dealing with the Arab states. People on the left could look at the same facts and also agree with the principle. It's a bypass road, and say it's a tragedy because it takes the Palestinians, it takes from them any leverage that they would have had. People like me in the middle, I think, and see this as a bridge, believe that, let's be honest, for 18 years, the old strategy wasn't working. You know, and we have to just be honest about it and say it's not realistic to believe that states are going to defer their bilateral interests with each other for another 18 years when they have so much at stake. Maybe in 2002, the Middle East was different. You know, there was no ISIS. Iran's regional footprint isn't what it is today. So I'm not talking about what happened in 2002. I'm just saying 2020, let's be honest about this. So I want to say is let's use it as a bridge. And here I feel that if you look at Jordan and Egypt, the two countries that actually made peace with Israel, the only two other countries with treaties, and to be fair, the Emirates and Bahrain, I mean, they call it peace treaties, but these are countries that really never fought each other, which is actually great because their treaties are not about the past. Where's the line? How much military here, military there? No, it's all about the future. There's no baggage. I was in Abu Dhabi at a conference in November. I was in Bahrain and Manama last June. And in each case, you know, people are all very focused on the future. It's predicated on this idea that the U.S. is retrenching from the Middle East because of energy, because of a sense that maybe the era of fossil fuel might be coming to an end. And if the U.S. doesn't have the same interest in the Middle East and there's a vacuum, who's going to fill that vacuum? And as one Emirati official said to me, look, David, we don't know what Donald Trump's going to do, but we know there's one country that can't pull out of the Middle East because they live in the Middle East, and that's Israel. And we got to work with Israel when dealing with Iran. So I look at Egypt and Jordan, and I say these two countries, for someone who's studied my life focusing on this issue, it's precisely countries that made peace with Israel that actually had a stake in widening the circle of peace because they didn't want to be politically alone. They didn't want to be isolated. So I think that getting a country with the resources of the Emirates engaged, I know there's bad blood, and I just got off the phone with a senior Emirati official who's very much at the heart of a lot of these discussions. But my feeling is that's going to have subside. And instead of the Palestinians cursing Mohammed bin Zayed, the crown prince of the UAE, they're going to need to coax him and bring his resources to bear. I read an interview with David Grossman, who's like Israel's leading novelist, and he said, look, the connection points between the Emirates and Israel is going to be such that the Emirates will have a lot of leverage with Israel going forward. So I think we got to admit the API of 2002 is not the API of today. And we got to think gradualism. We got to think on how we could bring Arab states to be a bridge and not go the bypass road. I'll just give a couple examples. I want to stick to my 15-minute limit. And what do I mean by gradualism? Because I want to be explicit. I don't want to speak in generalities. My colleague Ghaith did a great job of talking about the security cooperation and how the security services are really a lobbyist in the Israeli system. in this regard of trying to look for openings. And I would, add on that to say, I think it means don't build outside the security barrier, because I think if you do, you're going to be shutting the door to a two-state solution over time. The Trump plan is not the pathway. And I think the classic ways in this regard that Israel doesn't build outside the fence, outside the security barrier, wall, whatever you want to call it, I think that is the ticket to keeping hope alive. You can say, well, you can't do two states today. The public opinion shows the public isn't there for all the reasons that Ghaith said and Dan said. But I think that in this case, there needs to be an active step. It's not enough to reaffirm a two-state solution. And I agree with what Dan said about steps that the Biden administration could do. Here, I think, one or 2 points that we could discuss, but I basically think that he's right. But I think we got to go beyond that, and we got to find ways to say, okay, this two states, you say it can't be implemented today, but how do I know as a Palestinian by deferring an issue, I'm not conceding an issue? And I think that land is a key piece of this to keep hope alive for two states. And on the Israeli side, the other gut issue on the Israeli side is terrorism, and what are you doing to combat it? And I think by saying that the Palestinian Authority should not give money to relatives of suicide bombers or perpetrators of violence. And we know this, Shin Bet people have stopped perpetrators, and you've asked them, why do you perpetrate violence? And I know my family for the rest of their life will be paid very well. So I think you've got to deal with this question of, do you incentivize people to kill? I think that there's a way that both sides extend some political capital to show the other side that they're really partners. So keep the two-state issue alive, not just in word, but deed. And on the Palestinian side, deal with the issue of not incentivizing violence. I think, and there's some other things we can talk about in, with sea areas and, different land classifications that could be done on the gradualist thing. I want to end just with a hopeful note in conclusion, which is, I know people could get very depressed about this topic and say, do I see hope? Do I not see hope? All I know is whatever the hope there was in the 90s, people thought if it didn't happen, this whole thing would collapse, about 20 years ago when things started going south. But somehow they didn't collapse. Somehow the Palestinian Authority is, 40% of the West Bank. It's not enough, of course, and that Israeli-Palestinian security services are cooperating. Yes, there's a little interregnum now over this annexation issue, which has passed from us, but they have been cooperating closely in the last 20 years in a way that were unimaginable. And people thought, well, if there's a Likud government, for sure Bibi Netanyahu would get rid of the Palestinian Authority, and he didn't. And even the settlers admit the Palestinian Authority is there to stay. Now, again, I think the status quo is not enough. It's not sufficient. It won't last. But I do think these two national movements have withstood a lot of negative news, and yet these institutions have proved to be more durable than the critics would have predicted. So I think before getting too depressed about things by saying it isn't solved tomorrow, like I said, whenever it's all or nothing in the Middle East, it's nothing. We should realize that gradualism has had its successes, and the security services have worked beautifully together for the most part over these years. And I still think we could build on this, and we shouldn't give up hope. There's too much at stake, and I think the developments in the Middle East we should see, however, as the wind's blowing in a good way, and they could be a bridge to fortify these structures and not a bypass road. So I'll stop right there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, David, for your cultivating our hope in these times and showing us what can be built on and what bridges can be built on in order to move things forward in a positive way. Lastly, we'll hear from Saliba Sarsar. He's going to be talking about finding common ground to move toward peace. Professor Sarsar was born and raised in Jerusalem and is the professor of political science at Monmouth University. His teaching and scholarly interests focus on the Middle East, Palestinian-Israeli affairs, Jerusalem, and peacebuilding. He's the author of a fantastic book, Peacebuilding in Israeli-Palestinian Relations, which just came out in 2020, and Jerusalem, the Home in Our Hearts. And his most recent edited book is What Jerusalem Meant to Us, Christian Perspectives and Reflections. He has 3 co-edited books coming out this year. One is Democracy in Crisis Around the World. One is one that I had the pleasure of co-editing with him and Ilan Peleg, which is called Continuity and Change in Political Culture, Israel and Beyond. That will be out next month in November and was done in the honor of my dad in bridging political science and anthropology. And in that book, Saliba also talks about peace building and the importance of both parties recognizing each other's traumas in order to move forward. And I have an article, a chapter in that about the legitimacy of the two-state solution. And he also has a book, What Jerusalem Means to Us, Muslim Perspectives and Reflections. He's the guest editor of a special issue in the Journal of South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, focusing on Israel, Palestine, and the prospects for peace. He's often featured in the New York Times and is a recipient of the Award of Academic Excellence from the American Task Force on Palestine, the Global Visionary Award and the Stafford Presidential Award of Excellence from Monmouth University, the Humanitarian Award from the National Conference for Community and Justice, and the Holy Land Christian and Ecumenical Foundation Award. So it's always a pleasure and it's great to have you back. You've Skyped with some of my courses in the past at MSU. So it's also nice to have you back and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Saliba. Now tell me when to put up your slides.
Yeah, I think I will use my own slides and not put anything, please. I'll do it myself. Meaning I will just refer to my notes and not put any slides up. All right, thank you very much. It's such an honor and a privilege to be with you. Thank you for all you do. And to my wonderful colleagues and friends on the panel, Dan, Ghaith, and David. It's an honor to be with you. I want to start and end on a very hopeful note. I will use my poetic interest and tell you that the door must remain open to Israeli-Palestinian peace. And I want to share with you simple truths that peace is always preferable to violence and war. Peace as path and destination empowers and enables. Violence, on the other hand, violence and war cause casualties, destruction, and pain. By conquering enmity, we value life, we enrich our soul, we heal the world, tikkun ulam. Therefore, peace must be an intentional act as opposed to an afterthought. It comes to Palestinians and Israelis when they make it part of their dreams and their reality, when they prepare for it. The dispute, however, lives on. Unfortunately, Israelis and Palestinians have painted themselves into national, territorial, and ideological corners. Over the years, they have played a zero-sum game, thus ensuring that peace will not materialize before one side surrenders and the other wins. And there are even groupings wanting the surrender of Palestinians before any peace is done. Both have suffered and continue to suffer terribly. Their lives, property, and future are continuously being threatened. While many have been sacrificed on the altar of extremism, others suffer from fear, trauma, and the unknown. Their descendants then carry the resultant scars and accompanying thirst for revenge. That is why the dispute continues on. On a very personal note, like most, if not all of you, I wish for peace to happen now, not in another 100 years, not even in another decade. It has to happen now. Israelis and Palestinians deserve better. They owe it to each other to settle their differences and pass on a positive inheritance to future generations. And therefore, I would like to share with you 10 basic principles which I believe can develop and sustain a common ground which we are seeking. First, I think that both sides need to reach a shared language and understanding of peace. And that's important in terms of the terms of reference and the parameters of negotiations. Otherwise, unfulfilled expectations, disappointment, and pessimism will sit in, alienating even further the national communities from each other. Second, they should acknowledge and harmonize the top-down peacemaking with the bottom-up peace building. The rulers and the ruled must eventually meet in the public square. Third, there must be socialization for peace. Education for peace and peace for education complement and complete each other. Imbuing curricula, media, citizens' relationships with positive images and values will generate goodwill, mutual respect and trust, and the willingness for cooperation. Many a time, agreements are signed, but the people are not ready for them. They need to be ready. Fourth, cease any activity that would aggravate conditions on the ground, including bombastic talk, settlement expansion, rocket attacks. This could heal the rifts and wounds from ideological rigidities, societal divisions, and religious dogmas. Fifth, negotiate in good faith and seriously, regardless of the statements and events on the ground, locally, regionally, and internationally. I know this is extremely difficult to do, but there needs to be continued negotiation in good faith. Now, what does it mean in good faith? It means that both sides desire to get to yes and commit to fulfilling agreed upon terms. Spoilers or opponents of compromise tend to disrupt negotiations when their narrow interests are not served. Six, prepare officials and the public for compromise and trade-offs. Without proper preparation, a peace agreement will have little public support. At best, it will result in a cold peace. Number seven, initiate joint local, national, international, or cross-border programs in support of human security, human rights, justice, pluralism, and socio-economic development to make people to live in freedom from want, in freedom from fear, and with dignity. Eight, make bold decisions that extend beyond the next election or political survivor. I know, again, this is extremely difficult. How do we convince a prime minister or a president to step down? Public officials unable to deliver a better tomorrow must make way for others who have the national and common good interest in mind. Ninth, do the best you can, but expect less than you hope for. The best that can be done might well fall short of the commitment needed to solve all issues. Yet, as I agree with my colleagues, small successes, gradual successes are crucial as they contribute to larger ones. 10th and last, secure regional and international support for both peacemaking and peacebuilding. Success depends on the goodwill and support of all stakeholders near and far. And this is important in terms of what was stated about the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain relationship with Israel, including even Egypt and Jordan and others that will come around. Use that as a bridge to tie the Palestinians, because what good if all the peace happens between Israel and Arab countries and the Palestinians are still live in dispossession? It does not work. The neighbors have to be dealt with, have to be addressed first and foremost. And so I move ahead to a final statement here. What I'm calling for is the changing of our ways. Changing our ways must be done. And this is the hopeful statement that I'd like to leave you with. We are neighbors, and we will be neighbors forever. The sooner we grasp this fact, the quicker we can work through our differences. What separates us nationally is minuscule to what unites us. While we have inhabited the same land for generations, certainly not in equal numbers, we have forgotten the meaning of inclusion and sharing. Let our amnesia dissolve into a reservoir of admitting our own wrongs and consider each other's rights. What separates us religiously is minuscule to what unites us. Goodness taps into the same source. Only by honoring each other's religion can we be faithful to our own. We have a responsibility toward each other. Wishing each other away is foolishness. conspiring or acting to neutralize one another is illegal and sacrilege. It runs counter to humanity's ethical and spiritual values. So I strongly believe from my own personal experience and my own intellectual progress that crossing the border between Israel and Palestine, crossing the border physically and psychologically is possible. Getting to yes is possible. The time is now, not in 100 years. The doors and windows to Israeli-Palestinian peace must remain open, and we need to act and contribute to that end. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of us for inspiring us, motivating us, engaging us, and how we can keep the door open and move forward towards the long-awaited Israeli-Palestinian peace. I wanted to ask a couple of initial questions before I open it up. I already see there's some questions, and you can already also raise your hand electronically. I'd like to first give you a chance to possibly react to each other if there's anything that you want to react to. It seems like there's a lot that you're saying that seems to complement one another in terms of the need to not minimize the importance of ground up measures and confidence building measures, but ideally you want everything working together, as Dan suggested, but as some of you suggested, the moment might not be ripe for that to happen. There seems to be a lot of agreement on the UAE deal possibly being a bridge for further movement. So if we look at all four of your comments together, where do you differ? Where is it a matter of priorities? I wasn't sure at one point if Dan was saying, well, if you look at the ground up without the top, then it could do more damage than good. Is that a point of disagreement or really not? So I wanted to kind of get the sense from you as to whether you're just kind of prioritizing things slightly different in a complementary fashion, or if there are actual points of disagreement in terms of what you would prioritize first. I also want to get your reaction to how the Saudi plan can work into this, because if you all think the UAE deal and Bahrain deal could be a bridge to further peace movement, and certainly the Palestinians cannot be left out and have to be brought in, could Saudi Arabia play a role of bringing its kind of plans back together and kind of also pushing with the right leadership in each country towards a framework that could actually lead to peace negotiations, even though the time may not be exactly right, according to some of you now. And finally, you were proposing kind of recommendations for Biden. Dan suggested that kind of initially and primarily what he can undo in terms of what Trump did in the past 4 years. But if you were going to, advise Biden, and some of you may already be doing that in his campaign, what, in terms of all your suggestions, would you highlight that he start off with and emphasize initially? So you can take part of that or all of that, but I also wanted to give you a chance to kind of react to each other and kind of highlight, perhaps, even though you complement each other, where there may be disagreement or different prioritization.
Oh, I'll jump in. Yeah, I'll jump in first. First of all, I think it would be terrific if Saliba formulated his 10 points into a kind of charter for peace. And I'm serious about this, in which governments and private individuals could adhere to it, even if there isn't a formal peace process. I think some of those issues were extraordinarily important. They're reminders that we're dealing with a conflict that was created by human beings, and it's a conflict that can be resolved by human beings. So I really applaud Saliba for putting together that 10-point set of ideas. I think you're right, Yael, that there isn't a lot of disagreement among us. I am a bit nervous, however, about small steps on the ground in the absence of a larger process. We've seen in the past 40 years that very often the best intentioned plans on the ground are mistaken for a final determination, and both sides being so suspicious about each other and nervous about each other's intentions are unwilling to accept something small at the outset in the hope that it leads to something else. It's, years ago, people said to us when we were negotiating, if you're wandering into a desert, you need to know where the oasis is. And so it's okay to say, just walk into the desert and things will be fine. But it would be better to have a map and some kind of an indication of where you're going. And that's why the small steps approach critically important, because of how bad things are on the ground. But they need to be embedded in something larger that says to the two sides that those steps are not the end of the road, but actually are the bridge, as David has been saying, to something different. With respect to your last point about the Biden approach, I think, what my colleagues have said is that that's not going to be enough, even if he does all the things on the list that I put out, because in a sense, all that does is get us back to where we were, in a way, 4 years ago, with all the bandages and bruises and experience of these 4 years. But I think it's a first step, and it's a step that starts with a message to the region that the details of the Trump vision simply are taken off the table. As I said, it says 2 states, but it's not really 2 states. It's an artificial construct designed to mislead people into believing that it's a 2-state solution. And I think once that's taken off the table, you can start a dialogue through the PLO office in Washington, through the consulate. You can encourage dialogue between the Israelis and Palestinians to try to get us back on track. But, in a sense, before you go forward, you have to undo some of the negative events of the past, and that's one way to start.
If I may, first of all, maybe with the general statement is that in these kind of discussions, I think it's very important for maybe not us as panelists, but any of us, audience and panelists who are engaged, not to be terribly wedded to our ideas. I think, as I think David said, we all have the same objective, and we're all struggling to figure out how to move forward. So as I make my comments, I have to preface it by saying I am very happy to accept any progress, whatever it comes from, whatever form it comes from. I think it's key to focus on this, because I've seen often in our both DC and beyond conversation that we become so invested in our specific ideas that we forget why we have these ideas. And there's an objective, these are just a tool. That said, I would say 2 things here. One is, look, my concern with focusing too much on the high politics, on the kind of top down, is, in my experience, you can't really focus on both. And often, if you're focusing on the high politics, the small steps, quote unquote, small steps suffer. And therefore, I think ultimately there has to be a prioritization. And I fear that the high topics, especially if we go into building terms of reference, are so contentious that it's very hard to get any kind of consensus around it. Because I think, look, any next administration or any next peacemaker needs to build an international coalition for peace. The US has to lead, but it has to lead, not monopolize. And to lead, you need to have a broad buy-in. And it's very hard for me to see how you can get broad buy-in of the Palestinians, Israelis, and others on any set of terms of reference. And I fear that it might lead us to a rabbit hole. So that's kind of where I would focus right now more initially. To Saliba's point and to Dan's idea of this charter for peace, I'm all for it. I think it is great. And I think, frankly, what we have really missed in a lot of our conversations is this basic lack of understanding of the legitimacy of the other side's narrative. Not embracing the other side's narrative. Obviously, you can't expect that, but at least acknowledge the legitimacy. That to me is key. Yet the question is who does that? Because on my own sense, if you put this as part of a diplomatic negotiation process, it becomes a political football. You take really lofty, important, key ideas, and you turn them into bartering chips. So I'm very skeptical and reluctant to do this in the same track that we do diplomacy and negotiations at. This needs a different track with different players, not only people like myself, lawyers and diplomats, but people, of course we have to be included, but you need religious leaders, you need cultural leaders, you need all of that. I think what we need is 2 parallel processes. If we start mixing the 2, both will suffer. To Biden, I would say the following. I mean, there is, I think, first of all, what Dan mentioned is absolutely key. And it's not only the steps themselves, it's the message, the signaling that is important, because it shows seriousness, and frankly, it allows everyone to re-engage with the United States. What I would recommend to him and to any president, to be honest, is what I've seen often in the US government is the way we approach this issue is either we deal with everything, the big stuff, or we do nothing. It's either presidential level or we just basically ignore it. And there's a happy medium where we continue pushing for some of these steps that all of us suggested to move forward without necessarily making it a presidential priority, A, because it's not going to be, and B, as I mentioned before, I think going for the big prize right now would fail, and I would not recommend to any president to do that.
I didn't know if,
Sorry, yeah.
yeah.
Look, I don't want to repeat myself about, we tried 3 times to do the big stuff. And there's, when we fail, I just feel, this comes with a price. And we all here on this panel agree that the 4th, I think, effort of Trump is a non-starter. I don't want to go to a 5th time unless I have a high certainty that we're going to succeed. There's a reason why there's failure on these core issues, the final status issues, because it really cuts to the core of the narratives of both sides. And it's, I just feel that the chance of failure, if we hadn't tried it before, I would be much more open to trying again. But I just want to avoid the straitjacket of all or nothing. And I don't want us to say rhetorically we're committed to 2 states, and yet not much stands behind that. So I'm looking for something that is a win, that on one hand shows seriousness to the other side, that the other side is really a partner, but on the other hand also plays into the domestic politics that each side gets something. The Israelis see the final status as asymmetrical against them. You could say, well, it's not against them. If you have peace, that's good for you, right? If you get to that point. But they tend to have equated big withdrawals with vulnerability. And part of it is the division on the Palestinian side with Hamas and Islamic Jihad. But leave that aside for now. I think what I want to do is to fortify the center of the domestic political polity of each side. And I think give each side a win that they could point to. Give the Palestinians a win that Israel is not building in most of the West Bank, which is outside the security barrier, and most of the settlements are inside the security barrier. But give them a sense that 2 states is not just words, but is deeds, and it means that you don't build. And to give the Israelis a win, which says, listen, you're not paying relatives of suicide bombers. You're not incentivizing the other side. The other side really is a partner. The other side is doing something that's hard. I just see too much of the drift in, following the polling data of Israel's slide to the right, of the Palestinian slide away from 2 states. And I want to fortify public support, because I know these leaders, without public support, they can't really move. And a thing we didn't even talk about tonight, which is Palestinian succession is coming up. Abbas is 85 years old. And let's be honest, in the middle of succession, these leaders, the successors don't compete on who's more accommodating. They tend to compete on who is more pure. And to put the final status issues out there in the middle of a succession period is certainly a recipe for failure. So I'm looking for wins that each side could point to, that they're closer to 2 states, and yet that these radical shifts, moves to the right in both politics, is going to stop. That slide is going to stop because the center is actually being able to point to an achievement. So I feel that to align the politics is going to require each side having a win that has the important advantage of getting us closer to 2 states and brings the public back, because the public has a profound sense of disbelief in this process. And we need to fortify the publics on each side that this is real. It's not about words, that people are not going to believe words. They'll only believe deeds. So I want gradual steps that really are deeds that really that people could see with their own eyes, and that I think will have an impact in fortifying the politics in both camps.
Yeah, I fully agree with what was stated. The people on both sides, both national communities, need to see a path forward. Gradual steps, wonderful, but at the end of the day, there needs to be a two-state, one which honors the Israelis and give them security, the other honors the independence and statehood of the Palestinian people and give them that security and well-being. Without it, it's a pity that another opportunity for peace is lost. One thing that I believe David said, and maybe Ghaith as well, which deals with, in my mind, that both Israelis, they have one foot anchored in the past and the other in the present. They really need to have a foot anchored in the present and another rising to the future. And if they do not do that, that will be another lost opportunity. If President Biden were to take office, just reaching out to both leaderships and telling them that we are serious about this, we have a way forward, we want to engage you and acknowledge you, and to be humble about it, but bringing a group like David and Ghaith and Yael and Dan and myself to the table to advise, that will be a tremendous opportunity. Usually it's like a closed club, using advice of people who are there day in, day out. They need to open up the box and allow new, fresh ideas to come forward, and to honor the Palestinian people, to honor the Israeli people. We are neighbors forever, whether we like it or not. The closest we get to this understanding, the better it will be. As related to the, one last point related to the Bahraini, United Arab Emirates, Israeli relationship, that relationship in my mind, I think the others would agree, would not have matured without the approval of Saudi Arabia. And when a succession takes place and MBS were to ascend to the throne, that might open up this further, and maybe there will be a full acknowledgement of the right of the Palestinian to statehood as a condition for further relationships with Israel. But that is all to be seen. The succession in Palestine and even a succession in Israel. A prime minister might change and somebody else might come about in 18 months or so. So a new generation and new thinking has to come in and to say enough is enough. We've wasted 100 years. We need to really revisit this once and for all and finish with it. And you could have parallel tracks, gradualism and acknowledgement from the top. So the bottom and the top can work together, and the happy medium is really in the middle. That's what will really resolve it at the end of days. So thank you very much.
Well, you are always wonderful to listen to. And I'm going to open it up to questions. I saw that there are several already in the Q&A, and there were several questions from my colleague, Mark Bernstein. So maybe, Mark, since we only have a half hour left, if you can just choose one or two of them, and Ariana will unmute you and you can ask them, and then I'll call on some others to ask their questions. Thank you.
Yael, no, I'll pass. I'd rather have the other people ask the questions. Thank you.
Okay, are you sure? Because we had several questions. You don't want to ask one of them?
That's okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Yael, you're muted.
I see that there's also a question by my colleague, Professor Amy Simon. I don't know if you're still on, Amy, because I know you had 2 4-year-old twins at home that might have called your attention, but if you are, can you see Ariana?
I am
Ina-san?
here.
Fantastic. Okay,
I'm
great.
here. I'm not on video, but I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you. My question is just one, because this is an area where I don't know a lot, which was about kind of the U.S. role right now, because you all spoke of the Trump plan as not the way forward and gave some examples of why that's the case. And I was wondering then what the relationship, because we've seen in the news kind of a lot of credit going to the Trump administration for these recent plans, the UAE and Bahrain plan. So I was wondering kind of what the relationship is between the US administration and these normalization treaties that have just happened, and how that relates to this, 180-page plan that you've all talked about as well. Thank you.
There's there was a Broadway play called Pippin in which Charlemagne says to his son, "It's smarter to be lucky than lucky to be smart." The administration gets very high marks for jumping in at a moment when the situation became quite ripe. But the backdrop to the UAE-Israel accord, first of all, goes back more than 25 years. In the 1990s, Israeli ministers were visiting Abu Dhabi and other countries in the Gulf as part of the peace process at that time. After that, when the process went into a kind of slow motion, the relationships that were being built continued. And so the Emirati Minister of State has said publicly, it was only a matter of time until the relationship would come out in the open. And they chose a time when the Trump plan actually would have probably crashed the region, let alone the peace process, by supporting Israel's annexation of, up to 30% of the West Bank with some trade-offs and kickbacks. And so back in June, the Emirati ambassador to Washington put out on the table, it's either normalization or annexation. And the administration was smart enough to say, all right, we're not going to get our plan going forward, but maybe we can pocket this idea of bringing normalization out in the open. So it's a great irony. A really terrible plan made things on the ground so bad that it helped convince the Emiratis to come forward. One last point, and everybody knows this, and I think it was David who said the Nobel Prize for Peace should actually go to the Ayatollah in Iran, because the real issue for the Emirates has always been having a security umbrella. The United States has been their security umbrella for decades, and they've become concerned about the possible retrenchment and maybe even withdrawal of the United States from that role. And Israel is not going anywhere, as they said, and therefore it's a smaller umbrella, but one that the Emiratis figure they might as well use in the possibility of a storm with Iran. So, a combination of these circumstances ended up making the Trump administration smart to be lucky.
Can I add to this, or I agree with everything that Dan said. I mean, just think about it. The year started, kind of in one direction. Let's say if we divided up the year in three parts, 2020, January 28th, the president said, here's my plan for Israeli-Palestinian peace. Immediately was rejected by the Palestinians, and Prime Minister Netanyahu saw in this an opportunity to say, they rejected, well, what about the 30% in your plan? I accept that. And that was part two, and that took up a good part of 2020, really till the end of June, to focus on annexation, which, as Dan pointed out correctly, scared a lot of people. The Emirati move comes against the backdrop of, when I said in my remarks and what Dan just said, which is the sense of that the U.S. might have retrenchment, that the U.S. could be leaving a vacuum in dealing with Iran, and the Emirates saw Israel as a key bulwark in filling that vacuum. But it also, timing, as they say, it makes all the difference. So, there could be aligned strategic thinking, and there could be an amazing technological opportunity for these two countries economically. But if you didn't have timing, this would not have worked. To bring us to the third part of 2020 on the Arab-Israel issue, and that is this sense of the alignment of the political stars in the United States. That the Emirates, to close this deal, the Emirates had to come to basically two conclusions, in my view. One, that Trump is in an uphill domestic battle for re-election. It is the fight of his life. And as part of the fight of his life, he can extract, the Emirates can extract top dollar from the United States because all of these peace agreements with Egypt and Israel, Jordan and Israel are really three-way agreements. They're not two-way agreements. Each one had arms sales connected to it. And so the timing that was the master stroke from an Emirati perspective was to understand, look, I've wanted this F-35, the JSF, the Joint Strike Fighter, since 2012. My best chance to get it is when Trump is fighting for re-election and I've, made peace with Israel. That is my moment to get this JSF, not to mention the Reaper drone and stuff like that. And so one set of timing was the Trump re-election, that this is the time to get the optimal price from the United States. And the second, which sounds like it's mutually contradictory, but it isn't, it's actually reinforcing, was a sense that the Trump era might be coming to an end. And this president might not win. And therefore, what you might need is political risk insurance for the post-Trump era. Because Congress, a new Congress, you don't know exactly what it's going to be. And if the Democrats win, there might be a focus on what's known as JCPOA, that's the Iran nuclear deal. And the Gulf states that were the flavor of the month for the last 4 years might not longer be the flavor of the month. And people might have questions about the Yemeni war that the Emirates was once involved in, and other things. So peace is still something that has an allure that would provide you some risk insurance if suddenly the tides turn in the United States in the post-Trump era. So the master stroke from, and I think really the Emirati ambassador to the US, Yosef Otebo, who was the architect of this whole thing, was understanding that the Trump plan hit a wall, annexation hit a wall. He could be seen as the person who rescues, brings annexation to an end as a political idea. And from his bilateral perspective, sees the moment of getting the best price in terms of the Trump election and position the Emirates for a post-Trump era. These are not mutually exclusive. They're actually reinforcing ideas. So you need a bilateral, a compelling idea of why you want Emirati-Israeli peace, but it's not enough to have a compelling idea with these macro forces of US retrenchment in the post-energy era. Timing is crucial. And that was the master stroke, I think, of the Emirates in terms of this 3.0, if you want to call it, in terms of if we divide up the year 2020.
Thank you so much. I think we have a question from a student, Grayson Dwyer. If you're still on, Ariana, maybe you can unmute him, and then maybe we'll have Professor Alon-Tal ask his question because it's like 3 in the morning in Israel. So we need to get him, we need to get him dibs for staying up so late to ask this question. Is Grayson still on? Or
yes,
okay,
I am.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Hello, I hope you're all doing well tonight. I just had a question regarding the old formula mentioned by Dr. Kurtzer for trying to achieve peace between Israel and the Palestinians. So what I wanted to ask is, can you expand what the old formula is and why it didn't work?
Well, it's appropriately directed at me, the oldest person on this call. Look, the formula that the United States and the parties developed in conjunction with each other emerged in the early 1990s, launched at the Madrid Peace Conference, which broke through a lot of the procedural issues that had divided the parties. And then the final procedural and substantive issue that was negotiated in the Oslo Accords of bringing the PLO into the process around the idea of what essentially was to become a land for peace formula Oslo had its weaknesses, and in a different setting, we can go over those. But this came together in the 1990s when Israel and each of its Arab neighbors, including the PLO, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, started negotiating bilaterally. And the United States in the first in the Bush administration, the George H.W. Bush, and then the Clinton administration, conceived of a multilateral parallel track that was designed to do the outside in, to bring the Arab world in support of these bilateral negotiations. So the concept, in a sense, that I laid out earlier, which was this 6-part beast of everything kind of working in conjunction with each other, was actually part of the concept back in the 90s. It's just it didn't work for a variety of reasons. First of all, in the midst of what possibly would have been some progress, the Prime Minister of Israel was assassinated as a result of very significant internal differences of view between him and, at that time, Benjamin Netanyahu, the head of the opposition. There's a question of whether Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, had really absorbed what he needed to do and the concessions that he would have to make. When he was tested on this at Camp David in the year 2000, he fell short in response or in non-response to a rather interesting set of ideas that Prime Minister Ehud Barak brought forward. So, you end up with this back and forth, one side believing that the other is at fault. So Saliba mentioned the question of narratives. Each side has its own narratives. And you end up with a process that got broken. I would add one other critical point, which is why I added in the idea of accountability. If you look at some of the books from those who participated in the negotiations in the 90s, when the US conceptual approach was first solidified, they make excuses for not holding the parties accountable. It was the idea that if somehow you held the parties accountable, it would be like falling off of a bicycle because you had stopped pedaling. And what happened was, when you kept pedaling, even when the situation on the ground was getting worse with settlements and with violence and with Palestinian kind of incitement in their press and Israeli settler activity, it cut out the underbelly from the process. And so you ended up with negotiators meeting in these rooms in hotels, but with no public support in either community.
I don't know if Professor Al-Omari is still on. Do you see? Okay, maybe if you could unmute him, and since you're up so late, it's like 3 or 4 in the morning. Al-Omari is the chair of the public policy department at Tel Aviv University and has a Serling visiting Israeli scholar who's teaching at James Madison College this semester.
Okay, so I think I'm good to go. I've been allowed in. Can you hear me, Yael?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Terrific. So I guess first of all, congratulations to all the speakers who I think were erudite and thoughtful, and I agreed with most of the prevailing sentiment. The fact is that in teaching a course this semester at Michigan State for the 6th time running, I realized that I might have internalized something which is happening amongst many Israelis. In speaking about the Arab-Israeli conflict in the past tense, cognizant, of course, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict continues to fester. But it seems that events of this week in our class was lucky enough to be held exactly when the ceremony at the White House took place, and so we did watch it and discuss what the implications were. But it suggests to me that we've reached a turning point and that there will be a steady, how should I put it, recognition or pragmatism amongst Arab states, that willingness to make some sort of accommodation with Israel. And my question is this something that you all would agree with in terms of your perspective? I know as many Israelis seem to be moving in that direction. And second of all, if it is indeed the case, is this some sort of a kick in the pants, if you will, or a wake-up call, perhaps be a nicer way to put it, to Palestinian negotiators to suggest that disengagement has been an unsuccessful strategy and has played against the Palestinian interests, and perhaps they need to be much more aggressive in pursuing a peace agreement with Israel? That's my question.
If I may take a first attempt at it, I mean, do I expect to see more of this? Absolutely. Now, not necessarily more of the same. I mean, I would differentiate maybe between two kinds of normalization. Normalization with a big N, which is what we saw from UAE and Bahrain, a full agreement to normalize, ultimately leading to diplomatic relations and the whole thing. I'm not sure we're going to be seeing many more of these. Maybe Sudan, if Sudan gets what it needs. Maybe the Omanis, once they settle their things, their internal things. But by and large, there is a very limited number of candidates for this kind of repeat of what we saw in the recent weeks. I expect to see, though, a different kind of normalization, which is a more gradual, more kind of small N. And here I will put Saudi Arabia, I'll put Morocco, I'll put some of these countries that will be doing certain steps with Israel for short of full normalization. We saw the Saudis, for example, allowing Israeli flights to fly over Saudi airlines. I can expect to see the Moroccans again allowing more openly Israeli visitors, especially during Jewish holidays for the Sephardi North African Jews in Israel. So I expect to see a lot of these kind of issues, but I really don't see at least the big player, Saudi Arabia, moving towards full normalization in the short term, but they will move gradually towards it. The question to me, and actually this goes to a point that Yael raised earlier, and I did not respond to, is can we use this gradual normalization to push for some of the gradual ideas that we've been talking about? The problem right now with this approach is that the Palestinian leadership, as you yourself alluded to, has not yet gotten the wake-up call, if you will. I think they're still in the kind of shock phase of everything. What we have seen is actually a major departure from the way that, from what they've been used to. I think it came as a shock to them. Should not have. Any analyst would have told you we were heading there. But having it become real, I think, was shocking. What they did is that they went for their normal toolbox, go to the Arab League, et cetera, realize that it does not work. And right now they're at a loss. Now, they're not in any hurry to adjust, because for them, they want to see what happens in the United States. If you end up with a Biden administration, they will find a way of climbing down from that disengagement that they have, and maybe they think that they can leverage relations with the US to get something more. If there's a Trump administration, they will have to adjust based on that. So they're in no rush to move. Within the leadership itself, I think you see, again, a spectrum. Some, and I would say maybe Abbas himself, is of the camp that has not fully internalized not only the significance of these moves in their own right, but what they indicate in terms of the shift in regional priorities, center of gravity from the region, moving more and more to the Gulf. I think there's an old school in Ramallah that has not not internalized that. But when you talk to other Palestinian high officials, they tell you they get it. They get it. But the point that David mentioned again, in a succession dynamic, at the time when Abbas has all the strings and anyone who dissents pays a very heavy price, none of them are actually making their views public. So all of this to say that I do not expect to see any change on the Palestinian side until we have the the American elections. Once that happens, it really depends on how domestic Palestinian dynamics play out. Would Abbas be weaker, stronger? It remains to be seen. The other problem, and I will conclude with this, is that as we speak of all of this, I have felt really no appetite in the Gulf to re-engage in this Palestinian-Israeli issue in a meaningful way. You talk to the Emiratis, they will tell you, we've done our bit with the annexation, with stopping annexation. We don't want to get involved any further. You talk to the Saudis, they might agree in principle of having to link their policy to the Palestinian issue, but they tell you, we don't want to touch this issue. We don't trust Abbas, we don't trust Netanyahu on any of these. So you really have to overcome a degree of reluctance on the Palestinian side, but also a degree of reluctance on the Gulf side. And here again, American leadership is key. A strong US administration that goes to the Arabs and say, we want to use this normalization, which we know you're doing for your own reasons, to push the Palestinian-Israeli track. I think that will have resonance. Without that, I fear that we're seeing more and more divergence between the Arab-Israeli and the Palestinian-Israeli tracks.
Can I come in here for a second, just to reinforce what Ghaith has said? I mean, look, right now we're still in the middle of the shock. Like I said, I mean, if Abbas isn't woken up by the fact that he doesn't have support in the Arab League, that for decades, if it was dark outside, would say it was light outside to support the Palestinian cause, blindly followed the Palestinian cause, and now seems to have somewhat abandoned it, you know, then nothing is a wake-up call. And if you needed any reinforcement, I mean, these very days, yesterday, today, tomorrow, I would urge your viewers to go to YouTube and push in the name Bandar ibn Sultan, who was the Saudi Minister of Defense. It's already that the first two, I believe, I'm told already has English subtitles, has done on Al Arabiya, which is, you know, it's Saudi-backed, it's London-based Middle East TV. It's very prominent. Some people have heard of Al Jazeera. This is of Qatar. This is like the counter to that. And in the Arab world, it's a very prominent network. You know, 3 nights in a row in prime time, like 40 minutes a shot of the Saudis saying, we've covered up for the Palestinian failures in diplomacy for a long time. And we've never talked about this publicly because, you know, our concern of the Palestinian cause. But now it's time to talk about it. There's the shock, I think, is going to get worse, is what I'm trying to get at before it gets better. I assume it'll take months for things to cool off, for these guys to be more in the bridge building business. Right now, there's a lot of anger. The Emirates, you know, they're not exactly thrilled to embrace the Palestinian cause while people are stepping on photos of their leaders in the Ramallah and burning them in effigy. So I don't think this will happen immediately. I think the shock will deepen, but I do think, you know, there's too much history, too little geography. And like I said, I think Arab states actually, once they're in the peace thing, find that actually whatever their views are, the Palestinian issue, they become more involved rather than less involved. But I just think the Palestinians should realize that what America is going through, which we haven't discussed tonight, you know, COVID, the fact that the economic implications of millions of people unemployed, you know, those are 2 separate crises. There's been some social strife in our country that I think people know by watching television every day and seeing it in the streets. Third, fourth, there's a question about our institutions are coming under assault, you know, and I'm not even getting to China and trade. I mean, whoever wins this election in November, and we're assuming that, you know, that will be settled, there's big things for any new administration to deal with apart from Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. And my concern is if the Palestinians don't wake up after this Arab League meeting and after this 3-part series this week of Bandar ibn Sultan, you know, I think America's got other priorities. Ghaith, I think, is the one who said it well, which is not everything has to be run by the President of the United States. And these incremental issues maybe could be happening at a lower level. But you hear people like around about saying, okay, now let's pick up where John Kerry left off. I mean, they told us in 2014 they'd get back to us in a week. That was 6 years ago. Let's pick up where Ehud Olmert left off in 2008. Ehud Olmert's been out of power for 12 years. You know, I mean, so there's a need here to understand the reality we're in and maybe to use the soft linkage that the Emiratis did, which is like they got annexation off the table, to try to tell the Arabs, you know, instead of us, you know, withholding getting close to Israel, get closer, but put forward a condition that includes us on this incremental path. So I think we could be creative. We could think out of the box. We could think differently than the old paradigms. And I would, like I said, I hope the Arab states hear that they're part of a solution. And the anger is deep now, but the region's moving on. And I think the Palestinians do need to recognize. I'll just give one anecdote. I'm sorry to go on so long, but, you know, for example, the Palestinians said, no, We won't take our own salaries from clearance revenues that go through Israel so long as annexation is on the table. But annexation is off the table. Palestinian people are not getting paid their salaries, not because of Israel, but because Abbas doesn't want to move them anyway until he knows what happens in the US elections. And so this seems there's a lot of self-inflicted wounds here that need to be addressed. And, you know, and it's got to be worked out, you know, in a new administration. You can't assume if Joe Biden wins, you're just going to have a magic wand and we're back to 2008 again. There's a lot of changes on the American landscape and on the regional landscape of the Middle East.
Well, I always feel like I can listen to you all for hours, but we don't have much time left. So what I'm going to do is collect a few questions, pose it to you all, and you can pick and choose where you want to go. But there were several questions that centered on Biden or Trump. So Colin Jewell wrote, what is the Biden plan? Jeffrey Lieb said, what about the Trump approach? You guys haven't addressed that as directly. Professor Ben Lorch says, what about if the next administration is so absorbed with domestic efforts and problems that they kind of are disengaged from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What happens then? So all three of those questions kind of center on either of the next administrations. We also have a student, Ashley Gray, who posed kind of what is really the main factor that's inhibiting conflict resolution. And we have a community member, Stan Kaplowitz, asked, you know, what would kind of Jerusalem in a future deal look like? So that's a lot to throw on you. Three of the questions kind of relate to each other in terms of, you know, what is there a Biden plan? Is there a comparable Trump plan at this point? What if neither does a whole lot to engage the conflict one way or another? And so those all three relate to each other. And the student is saying kind of what is the main issue now that's keeping kind of all your suggestions from happening. And I know there are many such challenges, but if you were going to focus on one. So that's a lot to throw at you. You can pick one or two things maybe for each of you to close with, or something else that you'd like to close with.
Well, David Makovsky answered a couple of these in the previous response. A President Biden is going to have such a plethora of issues on his desk, both domestic and international, that this issue will probably not feature prominently. And if in fact a President Biden decides to try to undo some of the worst aspects of the Trump administration's approach, that's going to be hard because it will require some political capital to be spent on in the Congress. The Democratic Party platform is pretty inconsequential. It talks about a two-state solution and so forth, but so far there is no quote unquote Biden plan. The prospects of the Trump plan, I think, are, if I were to be charitable, they are minimal, but I'm not a charitable person with regard to the Trump plan. It is dead on arrival. It's an immature, wrong-headed approach. And if we had time, I could list the 25 or 30 fatal flaws that in that plan. So that's not going anywhere. And I think, we just have to wait and see how far some of the issues that my colleagues have talked about, Palestinian succession, will that yield a leadership that will get out of its bunker and start to think more proactively? Several of us are on Zoom calls several times a week thinking about this. And a constant feature of these Zoom calls is the idea that Palestinians have to come up with an initiative. They have to start thinking proactively and not simply respond to what others are doing in negative terms. So let me stop there.
Let me to be engaged in multiple fields all at the same time. I know it's a tall order given everything we're going through in this country, but I think there are very thoughtful people, including the ones who are on this panel, who can really champion this and move it forward. The Palestinians must re-engage immediately and not wait for a Biden or a Trump re-election. It is extremely important. They must re-engage with Israeli society, and they must re-engage with the Congress. They need to figure out a way to connect to the American public and sell their case to the world community. A lot is to say, oh, we don't like it, therefore we are retracting now. I don't think it's the right strategy. What they need to do is become proactive, just like the Israeli state is proactive in advocating for its own interests. I strongly believe that it is in Israel's best interest to cultivate the Palestinians and do it not in a haughty way, but in a way that will give them the dignity and the acknowledgement that they need, that they deserve in a sense. It is also up to the Palestinians to choose their own becoming. It is important if they announce to the world, not because they are pressured to do it, but because it comes out of their own volition, to choose a path that is democratic, that is pluralistic, that is demilitarized, and that is neutral, which is what we stood for in the American Task Force for Palestine. This, in a way, will show the world, will show the Israelis, the Americans, the Arab world, that there is serious thought that the Palestinians deserve a homeland, just like the Israelis do, and they want to live in security, prosperity, and peace with their neighbor, just like Israel wants to live with its neighbors in peace, security, and peace.
Look, I mean, it's unfair to expect the Biden campaign to have a plan right now. As everyone said, this is not a priority. And anyways, campaigns don't have plans until you're in office and you figure out what you're really dealing with. But I think if the the Biden administration, if he's president, does even the minimal steps that Dan mentioned, I think the signaling power of this is going to be tremendous. It will allow the Palestinians to re-engage. I think it will energize the Europeans who have been feeling very nervous about this and really the last couple of years have been at a loss of what to do. So I think even these minimal plans can inject, minimal steps can inject a lot of energy in the process. For the Trump administration, I think it was David who said it. Part of, the appeal of the UAE initially and then the Bahrain deal is that the Trump administration realized that their plan is dead on arrival. And in many ways, this was a way of showing a success after that dismal failure. A second term would be an opportunity, if they so desire, to basically change course, finding ways to re-engage with the Palestinians. No one's going to ask them to necessarily immediately ditch their old plan. No one does that, but at least have a different approach that will allow for further engagement. To the question of what is stopping this conflict from being solved. As I said, there are a million things, but I think at the core of it is not a policy issue. It's more of an identity issue. I think both Palestinians and Israelis feel that their very identity, very aspirations are under attack by the other. Palestinians believe that the Israelis want to suppress their legitimate aspirations. Israelis feel that Palestinians do not recognize their genuine connection to the land and all of that. And I think this translates into every interaction they have between the two sides. And sometimes it becomes, I think all of us on this panel have engaged in what we thought were policy conversations, only to realize these were airing of grievances kind of conversations. So I think a big challenge is how can we decouple the two? How can we have a track in which we do exactly what Saliba talked about in his presentation, of dealing with these issues, of assuring each side that they are accepted, that their fundamental identity is accepted, and no solution will try to snuff that kind of identity, while at the same time having a more rational, more practical, more pragmatic track. Not easy, but I think unless we do it we're going to end up with the same circle that all of us have been scarred with in the past.
I'll end. It was my last answer. I had a little tough love on the Palestinian side, so maybe I'll end with a little tough love on the Israeli side. There will be a tendency, especially I think if President Trump wins, which we haven't maybe talked enough about. I think of the president's team saying, listen, we now know what works. We're just going to go full speed ahead of normalization. And the Palestinians, they're going to have to deal with us for 4 more years. They've been boycotting us since December 2017, since the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem. They'll wake up, and there'll be a tendency, maybe in some in Israel, who said, "This is a bypass road on the right, and let's just ride with the Arab states." Who would have believed 1948 Israel fought wars with 48, 56, 67, 73, and now Israel's best relations with the Arab world are with the security services and the like, and now the chances of economic openings, especially with the Gulf. So if you're an Israeli, you might think you're at the cusp of a messianic age even. It's never looked so good that the Emirati ambassador would say, Israel is an opportunity and not a threat. So this is a remarkable moment in time, and we need to realize how big this moment is. But there is a danger from my perspective that the people on the right get the wrong message here of the bypass road. And I think be careful what you wish for, I guess, is my final thoughts here. Because if the Palestinians say there's just no hope, there's no 2 states, the Arab world has totally left us behind, okay, maybe our leadership is not adept enough to turn this into a bridge. For whatever reason, we want 1 state. We want to start voting in Israeli elections. Now, that might sound fanciful to people now. And when we look at the polling data of 1 state, it's more 1 state where, like on the settler side, on the Israeli right, it's a mirror image that it should be either all the Jews have the right on the right side, and on the Palestinian side, well, this will one day be all Muslim, and that'll be a 1 state solution there. So each one uses the word 1 state, but it means different things. But I think, so be careful about the terms you hear. But I think the 1 state idea that it's a binational approach, which I think is completely unworkable, given all the traumas on all sides. They don't even speak the same language. And as Ghaith said, they basically each one wants to fulfill more their nationalistic aspirations than we've seen in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, that when you think you've submerged ethnic differences under a unitary shell, the guns just turn inward. And the bloodiest wars are civil wars. And we've seen that. The 1 state solution does not work. But there will be a temptation, I think, especially if Trump wins, ironically, when some might feel the Palestinians are on the ropes if he's reelected. I'm worried that we will see parallel phenomena, that there will be the sense of the Trump side, now the Palestinians have to come to us and accept us on our terms. And at the same time, this 1 state impulse, I fear, will grow. People throwing in the towel on 2 states. And my fear is, and there'll be some Israelis will say, okay, as Alon Tal said, the Palestinian conflict is behind Israel now because the Arabs are now coming with Israel. And I'm worried about this illusion of the bypass road, because I don't think it's real. I worry that it will create pressures in the United States, even for people to say, okay, if there's no 2 states, 1 state, DNA of America, 1 person, 1 vote. What's wrong with that? And I don't think Israel's just going to say, oh, we were wrong about Zionism since 1948. And Palestinians are not going to so easily give up on Palestinian nationalism. But there will be a certain wave, which I worry is just going to be one big distraction and take us all to a place that is the wrong place. So I think there's no substitute for 2 states. I think we have to get there gradually, but we need to keep our eyes on the prize. On this is the goal, and I'm just worried in a second term there will be this temptation, I would call, in these opposite directions that I don't think are helpful.
Did all 4 of you speak? Yeah, I just want to make sure. I thought so. I just want to make sure. Well, it's been such a privilege having the 4 of you speak to us this evening and spend 2 hours with us. All 4 of you have spent, it seems like, your lives dedicated and committed to trying to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I have the deepest respect for all 4 of you. You provide us with a lot of intellectually stimulating thought, but also actually concrete actions that people can take, and everyone who gets hopeless and thinks, oh, there's nothing to be done, this conflict will never be solved. I think through the four of you, you came up with about 30 ways things can move forward and how they can move forward. So there are lots and lots and lots of things that can be done. It's not predetermined. And I think I always say we'll always have the biggest party ever when one day, hopefully all of us do see a two-state solution and a peace agreement in our lifetime. I know there are almost 100 people participating. Some students sent me questions right before. I didn't get a chance to get to all of them, unfortunately, but I read through all of them, and it seems like the vast majority were answered in one way or another through the 2 hours that you spent with us. So hopefully people can be somewhat satisfied with that, even though we couldn't get to every question. But it's been such a privilege. All of you are inspiring, and it motivates us as students and faculty and community members to keep up our hope and do what we can academically and outside of the classroom to move things forward in a positive direction. Thank you so much for that. I feel very motivated and inspired from listening to you, even though there are many, many challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.